Okay, so what we were talking about before the break was that we were focusing on identifying what hazards are and then the risks associated with those hazards. But when we're talking about obviously work health and safety, it's about trying to control the measures, putting some control measures in place to try and control those particular hazards so that the risk is reduced. And when we talked about the car example, obviously seat belts, those sorts of things to try and reduce the risks associated with that hazard of driving a vehicle. You will see in the literature a lot of references to the hierarchy of controls when you're talking about hazard identification and risk management. And basically what it's saying is, and some of it is just common sense, but what it's saying is if we're going to try and reduce the amount of hazards within a workplace, we probably should go through, or we need to go through a process to try and reduce them. And from a work health and safety perspective, the best possible way to try and the best possible way to reduce a hazard is obviously to eliminate it. So if there's a task that's being performed, what we talk about is if we can eliminate the hazard, that is the best possible method that we can use to get rid of it so that we don't obviously have any harm to ourselves or to others. But often that might not be the case. We might not be able to eliminate a particular hazard. So we then move on to the next step, which is either substituting the hazard. So for example, if you had a chemical that you needed to use within the workplace for a particular task and that chemical was toxic, you might still need to use a chemical, but you might be able to substitute it with something. So something that's less toxic, for example. We'll also talk about isolating a hazard. So rather than 40 or 50 people in the workplace all being exposed to this particular task or chemical or piece of equipment, we need to isolate it so that it might be certain individuals that are the only ones that actually touch this equipment. And often you'll see that from a manufacturing point of view. Engineering controls, and again, if I talked about that seatbelt scenario, that would be an example of an engineering control. Guards on kitchen equipment, for example, would be considered to be an engineering control. And then we move down to the lowest level, so the least effective but still measures that are often undertaken to try and reduce a hazard. And that includes administrative controls and personal protective equipment. So basically what we're saying is that as a last resort, if we can't eliminate it or substitute it or put any engineering controls in place, at the very least we need to have some admin controls. And that might be, for example, some policies, some procedures around using a piece of equipment or undertaking a task. And again, we talk about these things called standard operating procedures, and it's something that we're going to focus on as groups just in a moment. So providing some instructions on how to do a task safely. And as the very last measure, if all else fails, we need to make sure that we've got personal protective equipment. Now, often when you're undertaking a task, so for example, if we look at the use of chemicals, it might be a mixture of all of these different hierarchy of controls that we've looked at. For example, rather than use a toxic chemical, we've gone for a non-toxic chemical. We're using PPE by using gloves when dispensing it, or goggles, or what have you, respirators, all those sort of things. We also might have administrative controls when we're actually training people so that they understand what chemicals are being used and what they should be used for. So the hierarchy of controls is something that you'll see a lot in terms of work health and safety literature, and that a practitioner will go through to determine what controls should be put in place. Information, instruction and training, I don't intend to spend a lot of time on it, but suffice to say that it's absolutely critical that when a new employee starts within a business, we go through those induction processes with them so that the chances of being injured from a particular hazard are reduced. We also need to have some operating procedures, training sessions, as I mentioned, things like chemical usage, and often in a manufacturing environment we'll see references to standard operating procedures. So it might be up on a wall, for example, when using a piece of equipment, particularly dealing with those from a non-English speaking background. It might be more figures and diagrams rather than a lot of written information as well. So certainly if there was an incident in the workplace and an inspector from Safe Work SA came into the workplace, they would be looking for things like what training did that individual go through when using that piece of equipment, what sort of standard operating procedures have you got in order to make sure that you're safely using that equipment. They're all things that they would need to look at. Okay, bearing that in mind, and again, don't need to spend a lot of time on this, what I want you to do is in your groups, you're going to have a look at a template of a safe operating procedure. And rather than having to think about a particular hazard, we've actually got an example. So the first one, if I look at group 6, department, we've called it maintenance, but it could be bottle shop, required task to be performed, storing beverages in an underfloor cellar. And what I want you to have a look at is the key components of the task, identify the hazards associated with that task. What sort of safety controls would you put in place? How would you try and minimise that hazard? There is an area here that talks about legislation and codes of practice, but I'm not expecting miracles from you with that. But again, just a couple of dot points. Don't have to write War and Peace. Now, Group 1, for example, making coffee using a coffee machine. I'm talking an industrial sized coffee machine. What are the key parts of that process? What are the hazards? How are we going to try and control them? So again, in your groups, we'll just spend 5 to 10 minutes on those and come back and just briefly go through those. All right.